Everybody. I'm delighted to be speaking today with Juliette Vazard. Juliette is a colleague of mine in philosophy. She finished her PhD at the University of Geneva recently and has since started a position as a postdoc at the City University of New York at the Graduate Center there in Manhattan. And Juliette is an expert in philosophy of emotion. And while guilt is not the main emotion that she studies, she looks, for instance, at anxiety and other epistemic emotions. She has written some interesting work about it with Julian Deona. And today I'm going to be interviewing her about that chapter. Juliette, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mark, for inviting me. I'm very happy to talk to you about this chapter that I wrote a couple of years back, but it's going to be good to dig back into it together, and I'm excited for a discussion.
Great, thanks so much. So just to dive right in then, you say that the sort of characteristic traditional view of guilt is an attitude that we experience towards a deed of ours that sees it as sort of as wrong, or towards an action or an omission of ours as infringing a norm that we adhere to. And in particular, that there's usually some kind of potential to repair the damage that we've done in a proportional way. So if I feel a lot of guilt, then I feel an urge to do more to make amends. And if I feel just a little bit of guilt, then I feel sort of less inclined to make amends, or perhaps just as inclined, but to do less by way of making amends. And then you say that in OCD, the guilt is felt not over what someone has done, but merely over what they've entertained. You say that this is strange, but I wonder why you think it's so strange. In particular, I think, sometimes I feel guilty not just for what I've done or omitted, but also for my desires and my inclinations, even my patterns of attention, like the fact that I fail to attend to something that I should be attending to, which doesn't seem like an action or even an omission to act. So I'm wondering why there's this notion that OCD guilt is strange.
Okay, that's a big question. There's a lot in there. So indeed, in the paper, we try to make sense of the guilt that's experienced and attributed to sufferers of obsessive compulsive disorder. And we also want to see what we can learn from looking at guilt in OCD, in this pathological manifestation of guilt. So I think we agree with the idea that we can feel guilt towards certain of our character flows, or as you say, desires, ideas, and that is something that we agree with. We don't think that's the only we don't think that's the full picture of what's happening in OCD. What's happening in OCD is more complicated. There's a relation between guilt and how guilt is perceived by the individual themselves, and then other emotions like shame. And we think guilt in OCD, or the reaction that these individuals have to their guilt, reveals a certain view of themselves. But what we found puzzling is that in the psychiatric literature, we find the statement that OCD sufferers feel guilty about thoughts which are not desires. These are intrusive thoughts about harm or damage, specific scenarios that seem to pop up involuntarily in their minds repeatedly, and with which they do not identify. So they do not endorse those desires, those beliefs, these are not intentions that they have. So they are dystonic. We say they do not match with the view that these people have of themselves. And this creates kind of a tension and a distance and a doubt about who the person actually is, morally speaking.
Yeah, okay, so the idea is that it might make sense to feel guilt for, say, my plans or for my desires that I don't reject with second order desires or that I identify with. But if something is just kind of popping into my head and I think, oh no, not that, it is a bit odd to feel guilty about that thought entering my head.
It's the idea that a core requirement for rational guilt is responsibility. So you can feel rational guilt for actions that you've done, for omissions, for things that you failed to do, things that you failed to say. You can feel guilty about desires, and you can feel rationally guilty about character flaws, such as selfishness, insofar as you think you're responsible for these things, and you could do something. Part of responsibility is you could do something to change them, but you're failing to do so.
Yeah. Okay, so then, sorry, the main claim in the paper, as I understand it, is that guilt experienced by sufferers of OCD is actually best interpreted as a form of fear. It's fear of anticipatorily experienced guilt rather than guilt itself. And I wonder whether other emotions have this kind of structure in many cases. At least a lot of negative emotions seem to function in this way, at least sometimes. So for instance, I've written recently about Nietzsche on shame, and one of the things that he has to say is actually pretty close to what Diana thinks about shame. He thinks that over time, people develop what you might call it a sense of shame, which tells them, oh, if I do this, then I will feel shame, or if I do that, then I will put someone to shame. And then many people, maybe most people, most of the time, go out of their way to avoid doing things that bring shame on themselves or that cast shame on others. And so I wonder, again, merely thinking of an emotion as sort of anticipatorily and experienced doesn't make it pathological. In fact, it's good that people have this sense of shame, because then they don't end up experiencing shame itself. So how is OCD guilt different from this kind of sense of shame that prevents people from experience a current shame?
So I definitely agree that we are generally able to anticipate more or less well what we're going to feel in certain situations. And when we do anticipate a negative or unpleasant experience, we are motivated to avoid that from happening. And people have this to very varying degrees. It's suggested here that people with OCD have a really heightened guilt sensitivity. They are really averse to this experience of normative vulnerability that guilt is. And the interesting question is, why? Why are they so afraid of guilt? And according to our investigation, there's something like guilt for OCD sufferers is not experienced as good self having done wrong things or having thought wrong thoughts, but they're experiencing their guilt as a signal or as a sign that they could be someone who's morally extremely fallible, dangerous, cruel, inherently evil. And so it's as if they interpret those, because they feel dissociated from those intrusive thoughts that pop in their mind, they interpret those thoughts as reflecting or giving them a glance to who they could be. And there's this notion of feared self. So they are afraid of being guilty because being guilty reminds them. So generally the healthy experience of guilt is a good reminder that we can sometimes fail to live up to our moral standards, and we can sometimes violate standards that we adhere to. But in in the experience of people with OCD, this this reminder is not a reminder that we can sometimes be fallible, but we remain good. Instead, it's a sign that deep down, we might be really intrinsically evil.
That's interesting. I wonder whether it relates to a sort of misunderstanding of integrity. I sometimes feel like people have this notion that if you lose your integrity even a tiny bit, then there's no point in trying to be moral anymore. It's like an all or nothing kind of thing. And it sounds like maybe in the thinking of people who have this kind of scrupulosity, this particular moralized form of OCD that's kind of in the background, they're thinking like, well, if I could do something like that, then I must be a terrible person.
Yes, it's the idea that even the idea that one could do something bad, or that one is thinking about something bad, not even in the sense of intending something bad, but in the sense of merely entertaining the thought, that already compromises one's moral dignity in a way that's unforgivable or irreparable. So the intrusive thought introduces this dreadful idea about the kind of person we could be deep down, and that's drastically at odds with how we view ourselves. And so I think this dissociation between the intrusive thought and the view of oneself as a sane, loving, and not harmful person introduces the idea that's a common thread in OCD, that the self can't be trusted, and that I can't trust myself because for all I know, given the thoughts that pop to my mind, I could be someone else that I take myself to be. I could be really cruel, selfish, or evil.
Yeah, so that brings me to the next question that I wanted to ask, actually. So you mentioned this kind of self-distrust. And I know that a lot of your research has been on anxiety as a kind of epistemic emotion. And as I understand it, you think that anxiety is in many cases functional, but that pathological cases have kind of consumed too much of our theoretical attention. Did you get onto the topic of guilt and OCD by way of your work on anxiety? Because I guess it seems to me, kind of as a non-expert, that the obsession with checking that a lot of OCD sufferers have is a kind of pathological anxiety that rarely leaves them feeling satisfied, like, okay, I've checked, it's good, I can move on.
Yeah, there's definitely a link there, and I've definitely worked on anxiety in the context of the need for rechecking, and the kind of we can view rechecking as a form of evidence accumulation, where the person checks the stove, and if I touch the stove and I turn the buttons, I have now good evidence that the stove is off. The person walks away and they get kind of error signal or hyperactive feelings of uncertainty that make it so that they feel compelled to make sure again. But that's anxiety is not a self-directed emotion. So what's mistrusted, I guess, in the case of rechecking, is the state of one's knowledge. It's not the worthless, the worth of one's character, of one's moral character. Whereas it's generally considered that anxiety and guilt are the two predominant emotions that dysfunction in OCD. And I think the anxiety plays probably different roles in there, but I've been interested in the epistemic effects of anxiety in rechecking, and the guilt, and I think when it gets fused with shame a lot of the time, is responsible for the rumination about the self being worthless, that generates a different kind of compulsion, which are more like repairs, amends, compulsive apologies, and these kind of compulsions.
I see. Yeah. I mean, I guess they might be related, at least in some cases. Like if I haven't double checked and then I, for instance, get the time wrong and I waste your time by showing up 3 hours late to a Zoom meeting, as happened today, then I might feel guilty about that because, you know, if I cared enough, I would have double and triple checked and then I would have gotten the time right. So I guess, at least in certain cases, not to say that I'm currently suffering from OCD guilt, but I can see how these emotions would trigger each other. At least in some cases.
Yes, it's true, and that reminds me of a distinction we make in the paper between altruistic and deontological guilt. So
yeah,
I'm not sure what to make of it, but it's interesting for people to consider this distinction, perhaps. Some researchers think there is a significant distinction between a form of guilt that's altruistic in nature. It's guilt about having caused harm to others. And that's different from deontological guilt, which is substantially a guilt about having transgressed or violated some moral norm that we adhere to, disconnected from the effects that it might have had on other people.
Yeah, that's a useful distinction. You also draw this distinction between state guilt and trait guilt, which I guess is something that people in psychology might be familiar with. But for philosophers who don't use this kind of terminology, can you just explain briefly what the difference between state guilt and trait guilt is meant to mark out?
Yes, I think it's just a distinction between a mental state, one experiencing a passing episode of guilt as an occurrent emotion that is that has a beginning and an end, and one can perhaps point to what it's directed at. I might feel one episode of guilt right now about having forgotten to feed my dog or something, and that's a state. And trait guilt would be if I am if my character or emotional disposition is such that I tend on average to feel more guilty than most people, and that it's guilt is a typical reaction with which I approach a lot of events in my life. So I am disposed to feel a lot of guilt in general. That's trait guilt.
Right. Okay. So I guess there's two ways I've been thinking about trait guilt. One is what you're describing, which you might call something like a disposition to guilt, or a tendency to enter that occurrent state. And then another way of thinking about trait guilt would be kind of the way we think about moods sometimes, where you just kind of have this sense of being guilty, even though you don't know what you're guilty for. I guess people sometimes call this like Catholic guilt, where you don't even, it doesn't necessarily have an object in the way that moods sometimes don't have an object. So, you know, like free-ranging anxiety or something like that. You might have a kind of free-ranging guilt where you just feel this kind of burden, like you must have done something wrong, because why do you feel so terrible? But there's nothing you can point to. And that, I suppose, could be associated with disposition to feel a current guilt as well as a state, but is maybe a little bit different. Is that studied at all in the psychological literature, or is this just something that philosophers and Catholics talk about?
The kind of burden, let me understand. It's not a disposition. It's a kind of affective state that's in the background with you all the time, or does it sometimes occurs and sometimes wanes and vanishes?
Yeah, it's I guess the idea would be something like it's always in the background and sometimes it becomes more focal, in the same way that you know, anxiety as a mood without an object might be kind of in the background.
But I think it still occurs. I
Yeah.
don't quite understand ontologically how this state would work. I think I would still wanna frame it as a disposition to feel, maybe to feel certain kinds of guilt, often guilt that don't have specific objects.
I guess I'm thinking of like people who have this sense that, because they're human, they have original sin, and they're just guilty. They're born guilty, and they need to be saved in some way. Maybe this is just not something that you can easily wrap your head around if you haven't been raised in a certain way. But I think a lot of people have this sense.
It sounds like it connects back to what we diagnose in OCD a little bit, but to obviously a really pathological level. It sounds to me like shame-infused guilt. Sounds to me like a guilt that at its core or at its origin has a belief about the self as inherently deficient or faulty.
Yeah, I think that's probably part of what's going on. And this leads to a question I wanted to ask about shame, actually. So I know in the literature, it's quite common to distinguish guilt and shame by saying that guilt is about actions and shame is about the whole self. I've always found this to be kind of a puzzling way of drawing the distinction, because I think it's possible to feel shame for what you've done. I mean, just this morning, I went on Google and looked for the phrase in quotation marks, ashamed of what I've done, and it scored like 600,000 hits. So it seems like people talk in this way as if you can feel shame, not just for who you are, or what kind of person you are, but also just for actions. How would you distinguish shame and guilt if that's not necessarily the best way to distinguish them? Or do you think the traditional distinction makes more sense than I do?
No, I think it's more useful to think of it of them not being distinguished so neatly on the basis of the particular objects. Like guilt is necessarily about an action and shame is about the whole self. I think you can have both shame or guilt in response to the same event. And what differentiates those two reactions is that when I respond to something with guilt, I construe what has happened as some kind of violation that I'm responsible for, and I view the event I view myself as involved in the situation. Insofar as I'm the doer, I'm somehow responsible for what happened, but the emotion is not does not reflect the faultiness of myself. When I respond to an event with shame, I see the event as really reflecting a deep core failure of my character trait, something that I cannot easily or immediately change. So I see whatever event it is really as reflecting the fact that I am imperfect in some way.
So the idea is that with guilt, there's more of an opportunity for repair or making amends, and that the self is not as implicated, even though my agency is implicated. Me as an agent or my character is not necessarily implicated. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, when we feel guilty, we see that we have behaved badly.
Sorry,
but
I think we froze.
This to mean...
Are you still there?
I'm here. I'm here. Hi.
Yeah, sorry. The Australian internet is terrible. I'll go back.
Oh,
I'll go back and fix this.
So yeah, when we feel guilty, we see that we have behaved badly, but we don't take this to mean that we are intrinsically or permanently bad or evil. And through shame, I construe the situation and I construe myself in this situation as meaning that I'm inherently imperfect and fallible. So in shame, I really get to glance at the least desirable aspects of my personality or character, while I can feel extremely guilty, but still maintain an intact view of myself as just having, done an accident, or having, failed to remember the time difference. But this doesn't mean I'm a bad person. This just means, I slipped, but this doesn't change my view of myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So then I guess to bring things back around to this idea of fear of guilt, as I understood it in the chapter, you're saying that everybody experiences fear of guilt to some extent, but that what distinguishes sufferers of OCD is that they have too much fear of guilt, or that their fear is too intense, or that it lasts too long, or that it attaches to too many prospective guilty feelings, or something along those lines. And I guess, coming at this from the point of view of studying ethics, like if you take an Aristotelian perspective, that sounds like cowardice. Like for Aristotle, to be a coward is to be someone who fears too intensely, or fears too many things, or fears for too many reasons, or fears for too long, and so on. And I never quite know how to deal with the fact that sometimes we medicalize problems and sometimes we moralize them, and sometimes we do both. So it seems to me like it just to be kind of a category mistake to say that people who have OCD are therefore cowards, or have a kind of cowardice. But I wonder whether you have any thoughts about like how best to understand the situations in which it makes sense to medicalize versus the situations or context in which it makes sense to moralize. Is that something you've reflected on?
A little bit in the periphery, but I'm interested. I'm intrigued by how you're framing the implications for virtue ethics, because what this fear of guilt ends up creating is that people with OCD spend a lot of time thinking about ways in which they could violate norms and try to anticipate those situations and prepare and prevent. So we could also argue that they're really too conscientious, and that sometimes people say, are persons with OCD really extra virtuous with respect to someone who would really rarely consider the fact that they could perform dangerous or cruel or harmful behavior?
Yeah, that's interesting. So as I understand it, one sort of way in which OCD is expressed is through this kind of scrupulosity, where it's in particular like hypersensitivity and focus on moral norm violations by the self, which doesn't even necessarily correlate with judging other people very harshly. It's just judging the self very, very harshly. So you might think that like, well, people who have this kind of scrupulosity are actually more moral or extra moral, too moral. I think that that's one way of looking at it. And that's if you're focusing on norm violations or potential norm violations. But if you switch the perspective to the kind of virtue and vice perspective, then the question is like, do you feel fear for the right reason at the right time in the right way towards the right objects with the right intensity and so on? And this kind of Aristotelian doctrine of the mean is meant to apply to almost every emotion that people can have. So Aristotle says that, courage governs fear and confidence, but you would maybe have different virtues governing other emotions like contempt or disgust or joy or sadness, right? So like you might say that someone who isn't saddened by significant losses suffers from a kind of lack of care, that they don't have this virtue of care. And in the same way, somebody who fears too much or too strongly might be said to be cowardly, and someone who doesn't fear enough could be considered rash or overly bold. And yeah, I don't know, maybe that's just not a useful perspective when we're thinking about mental health. But it does seem to be a way in which it almost seems to be built into the definition of OCD, because it's not just you have a lot of fear, because you could just live a life where there's lots of threats and then lots of fear would be appropriate. It's something about pathological fear, like fear that is too much, or about something that's not just outside of the norm for people descriptively, but which is inappropriate or
But also,
counter-normative. Yeah.
I think it's hard to say whether OCD sufferers live in a world where there are lots of threats, because it's possible that as we discover more about how the brains of persons with OCD work to generate and create all of these potential threats, what seems to be clear is that they have a tendency to anticipate and generate scenarios of threats in their head much more than the average population. And then if that's what your brain feeds you, imagine living constantly with those intrusive thoughts of potential catastrophes and cruelty and atrocities you could do constantly popping in your mind. If that's the input you're given, given some dysfunctional mechanism in your brain, then isn't fear a rational response to your brain feeding you those scenarios?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's in many cases the right way to think about pathologies, is that actually this is just learning. This is a rational response to bad circumstances rather than just pure dysfunction in someone's personality.
Yeah, I think once we start at least envisioning what it might be like to, you can read reports of OCD sufferers talking about their intrusive fears, and it sounds really frightening to live in a brain that feeds you such scenarios at random during the day. So imagining what it would be like to experience that, definitely, yeah, we can connect to that experience and see how then these emotional responses to such experiences might be warranted, or at least intelligible.
Yeah, so I guess this connects with a point you make in the conclusion about this kind of feedback spiral that sometimes seems to occur. So you suggest that OCD patients are probably caught in a spiral of negative emotions that involves anticipatory guilt, fear of this guilt, and in all probability, guilt or straightforward shame at what this envisioned guilty state reveals about who they are. And it might even be worse than this. Like, for example, if someone gets an OCD diagnosis, they might feel guilt or shame over their mental health problems. So now there's the stigma of mental health diagnosis on top of all that. And they could potentially even take that to be an essential flaw in their character. So like the way you were describing it just now is like, there's something that happens in my brain that's not me, and then I'm fed these signals and I have to respond to them, which leads to pathological amounts of fear. But if instead I sort of own that and say, no, that thing in my brain is part of me and it's broken in some way, then I could potentially feel shame over that as well, I suppose.
Yes.
So I wonder whether, yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely that component that we've read in many reports, clinical reports, the idea that there's a meta emotion that's happening on top of the fear generated by the thoughts. The patients recognize that they take these thoughts far too seriously, so I don't know if that's coherent with what you just said, but there's definitely a judgment of patients to the effect that, oh, I'm insane. if that's happening to me, you know, that contradicts my view of myself as a sane and reasonable person. And people with OCD have a lot of insight. They're not delusional, so they're, you know, able to articulate their experiences and their evaluation of their experiences in a way that's coherent.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So just to give you an example, I have a visitor here in Australia right now who suffers from OCD, and in their case, this manifests in a really intense fear of bats. And you may know that in Sydney, there are these gigantic bats with a wingspan of over 1 meter.
I didn't know.
They're spectacular. I love them. They're very cute. But you can imagine if you're coming from Europe and you're used to these little bats, and you see one of these things, it would be pretty terrifying.
Pretty courageous to take a visiting in a place where your phobia manifests.
Yeah. I think so. And this person knows that it's a phobia. So in particular, they know because it used to be a fear of something else. And then 4 or 5 years ago, it became a fear of bats, and they know it's unreasonable, but they still feel it, and quite intensely, to the point where like they don't want to be out at certain times of day when the bats are flying. So yeah, I think this kind of illustrates what you're saying, that people who suffer from this, they can realize that it's not a reasonable fear, but they still have it, and then I've heard this person say, you know, like, oh, I'm just crazy and stuff like that, which is like an additional kind of stigma on top of it, everything else.
Yeah, a statement or even a meta emotion, shame of my fear. I realize how irrational, insane, ungrounded, and unwarranted my fear response is, and I feel, you know, can range from just mere embarrassment to deep shame for behaving and responding in this manner. So it's interesting to see how the story is always more complicated than we think. And in this paper, we really wanted to you know, have a serious look at what might be happening and all the different affective states that may be bouncing out of each other in OCD, because the idea that they just feel guilt in response to intrusive thoughts was not quite making sense of the whole picture. So yeah, it's definitely interesting to view emotions as things that can respond to one another, things that can happen at the same time, that can relate. So yeah.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. So earlier in the semester, we've been talking about higher order emotions, and it seems like in this case, we're talking about at least a third order emotion, because there's guilt, and then there's fear of guilt, and then there's shame at fear of guilt. So it's quite complicated. And
yeah,
you know,
not quite sure how the whole architecture functions in real time, but yeah, we've definitely tried to make the picture a little bit more more meaty, more complete. And you know, then I think some of these scenarios are going to apply more to some patients and other, you know, more to other patients. Of course, there's huge variability between patients, and depending on the themes of the intrusive thoughts and the type of compulsions, how people remedy to the thoughts. So there is definitely room for diversity.
Yeah. And I guess one additional thing to bear in mind is, you know, people can have this kind of shame that's self-directed, but if their friends or their partners or, you know, people that they deal with a lot are not really, if they're not understanding and empathetic, they can end up kind of gaslighting the patient as well and saying like, oh, you're crazy. So it's like one additional social burden on top of the mental health burden, at least potentially.
Yeah, because we judge each other's emotions and evaluate as more or less rational and verbalize those judgments. And this might create another layer of emotion as we internalize those external judgments that are posed on our that's why we shouldn't take it lightly to normatively evaluate each other's affective responses, because this has affective effects of its own.
Yeah. Really interesting. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure the students will enjoy watching this video. Is there anything else you wanted to say about guilt or about other research that you're doing?
Well, I just really enjoyed our conversation. It was really fun. It went in all kinds of directions. I don't know if there will be a chat where students can ask questions and I don't know. But no, at the moment, I'm very happy with all the different directions that we took, and I do hope the students enjoy it.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. And I will say goodbye now. Thanks, Juliette.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.